So you want to know more about the history of the Civil War, especially the coming of the Civil War. My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American history, and every Friday I post these videos in my So You Want to Know More About X series, where I introduce you to what I argue are some of the best books and articles if you really want to dissect a particular topic. Depth of knowledge that is sorely lacking in today's day and age. And I just finished teaching this last semester a graduate seminar on the Civil War that I absolutely loved. It was the first time I got to teach this particular seminar, which enabled me to try out a number of books on students. And because I am mostly interested in the origins of the Civil War, I often joke with my friends that my interest in the Civil War dies out once shots are fired on Fort Sumter, which is a bit of an exaggeration. But because of that, half of my semester was actually devoted to books on the origins of the Civil War. So that's what I want to give an overview of today. Here are the books that I strongly recommend if you want to have a better understanding of the causes and the trajectories that brought the nation to fight war with one another in the Civil War. Let's dig in. But before I get to the books, a little bit of a preamble, because the most common question that people get, especially scholars when discussing the Civil War, is what role did slavery play? Because unfortunately, there is still a loud segment of American society who perpetuate this fraudulent myth that the Civil War was fought over state sovereignty and states' rights. That is hogwash for a number of reasons, in part because the Southern Confederacy was strongly in favor of federal power when it strengthened the slave institution. And if you actually dig into the arguments that were made by the South when they were seceding, it was because they wanted to preserve slavery. And in the words of the inaugural vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, they wanted to build on the cornerstone of white supremacy, this new nation. So there is a broad scholarly consensus that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. But as scholars have emphasized in recent decades, that's just a starting point of the analysis. Because once you acknowledge that slavery was the cause of the war, you have to answer the questions of what, why, and in what political sphere, and how did they frame slavery? For instance, Northerners who opposed slavery, were they opposing the actual enslavement of individuals, or were they opposed to the slave power and the oligarchic control that enslavers and plantation owners in the South were? And then what brought Northerners to adopt this anti-slavery message, and what brought the South to adopt this adamantly pro-slavery secessionist message, to the point to where they became insurgents, conspiring, committing treason against the U.S. nation. So the books I'm going to highlight help tell this story of the origins of this conflict. By the way, if you enjoy this type of analysis, please subscribe to the channel. Every Monday I do deep dives on a particular historical topic. On Wednesdays I try to connect our historical background to contemporary issues, whether it be pop culture or politics or media or sports. And then on Fridays I do these So You Want to Know More About X series, trying to help broaden our understanding and our awareness of this great scholarship being written. Without further ado, let's get to the books. Up first is actually the book that was by far my students' favorite this last semester. It's Joanne Freeman's The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to the Civil War, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux a few years ago. This book is a history of the congressional debates and fights that led to the sectional conflicts. And by fights, I mean physical fights. Joanne Freeman, who wrote a previous book on dueling in the early republic, was able to peel back the documentary record to dig into what congressional life was like. And spoiler, it was a lot dirtier and messier and combustible than you might imagine. There were multiple instances of pulling out dueling pistols on one another or beating each other to blows. In other words, the famous instance in which Pierce Butler, the congressman from South Carolina, caned the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, that was the culmination of decades of fight. But more than just the fascinating glimpse on these very human congressmen trying to beat each other to a pulp in the halls of Congress. This tells a story of congressional fracture and how the politics of the nation that had been that binding the nation together for decades came to fall apart. And she tells a story through a number of characters, but her central character is a guy by the name of Benjamin Brown French, who was a clerk and a secretary to Congress, and he arrived from New Hampshire, a Northern Democrat, but by the 1850s, near 1860, he was a gun-carrying Republican. And so telling that story of how the political coalitions that bound the nation together fractured apart, that's the key part of The Field of Blood. And it's a very riveting story. Next, we need to get into the legality of slavery and racial laws. And Kate Mazur's Pulitzer Prize finalist book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. This is a brilliant and detailed and sophisticated look at the racial laws at the heart of American politics in the decades leading up to the Civil War, and even dipping in a little after the Civil War as well. It's including northern states who tried to institute black codes that had two different spheres of political belonging and identity, as well as the southern states trying to install their measures to assure the supremacy of slavery. And what I love about this book is it places the agency and the actions of Black Americans at the center of the story, that they were pushing and prodding and forcing the nation to respond. They weren't just the nameless, faceless, depraved, subjugated citizens. They were out fighting for their rights, and that fight pushed the nation along. The next book is Alice Baumgartner's book, South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War, published by Basic Books. In many ways, this is a dual biography of the United States government on one hand and the Mexican government on the other, and how their border evolved from the 1820s all the way to the Civil War. It talks about the Tejas settlers that end up forming Texas, that then declares independence as a republic and then is annexed into the United States. But more specifically, it talks about how these different nations, these different polities, dealt with slavery and especially dealt with one another. And she makes a convincing, powerful, and riveting argument that it is in America's relationship with these foreign entities and trying to preserve their own slave status, trying to bring back fugitives who had crossed the line into Mexico, and Mexico's refusal to sanction slavery, that caused American political divisions to start falling apart. It forced America to address questions that they had tried to avoid, and the final annexation of Texas and then the invasion of Mexico to take southwestern territories was the final tipping point that caused national rupture. Which brings us to the 1850s. And one question that's often on people's mind when they're talking about the South and the origin of the Civil War is they'll trot out this old false statement that the South was all about states' rights. One book that really disrupts that and shows how Southern states were pro-federal power was Matthew Karp's This Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy. Karp argues convincingly in this book that Southern politicians dominated national politics. And by dominating national politics, they had created this powerful imperial system that they believed was going to defend slavery in the new global sphere, which was why it was so terrifying when Northern anti-slavery proponents were able to take control of those levers of the federal power. Because Southerners had created the government to be so powerful that they recognized that once it was out of their control, it could be turned on them and destroy slavery. This is the best book to dissuade the myth of Southerners being all about states' rights, showing that Southerners were the architects of a powerful federal sovereignty. Then we get into sectional crisis. And one of the big tipping points, I'm writing a book on religion and abolition and the coming of the Civil War right now, so this plays out in my own research. But one of the big tipping points was in 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850, was a passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, which strengthened provisions to allow Southern enslavers to go into Northern territories and reclaim fugitives. That disrupted a lot of the national unions. And the book that I think captures that disruption better than any other is John Brooks' There Is a North: Fugitive Slaves, Political Crisis, and Cultural Transformation in the Coming of the Civil War. His thesis is simple, that from the founding of the nation up until 1850, there was a coherent, consistent, and unifying idea of preserving the American Union through slaveholding, but that the Fugitive Slave Law disrupted that and created a period of what he calls liminality, which allowed people to look out for new types of alliances and belonging, and allowed a resurgent anti-slavery party in the North to restructure these political alliances. And by 1846, you have this cultural movement that unifies some segments of the North that then allows a political realignment. And so by 1856, there was a cohesive political anti-slavery force in the North that was able to, for the first time, confront the slave power in the South. But if Brooks's book tells you about the origins of the Republican Party formed in the mid-1850s to confront the slave power, I also want to suggest a book that talks about the dissolution of the Democratic Party. And sadly, I've loaned out my copy of the book, so I don't have it with me right now, but it's Michael Woods's Arguing Until Doomsday: Stephen Douglas, Jefferson Davis, and the Struggle for American Democracy. This shows how the Democratic Party coalition that had dominated national politics for decades came to fall apart over the questions of federal expansion, federal power, where you have Jefferson Davis represented the stringent Southern view of we need to strengthen slavery in the West, even when that requires strengthening the federal government, versus Stephen Douglas, who stood on his power of state sovereignty. And this shows how the Democratic Party gave up its political coalition in advance of the 1860 election, which is what enabled the Republicans to win. All right, so those are my 6 books that I strongly recommend on the origins of the Civil War. Please let me know in the comments what you like when you read about the origin of the Civil War, what problems you might have of these books, and let me know if there's other topics you would like a rundown of important books. History has never been more relevant than it is right now. We need these discussions, and I hope to help bridge these worlds of scholarly discourse and the general public. So follow along on this historical ride by subscribing to this channel if you haven't yet, and like and share the video.